built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The rain came tumbling down. Oh, the rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rain came down as the floods came up. And the house on the rock stood firm. Oh, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. And the rains came tumbling down. Oh, the rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. And the house on the sand went splat. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. And the blessings will come down. Oh, the blessings come down as the prayers go up. The blessings come down as the prayers go up. The blessings come down as the prayers go up. So build your house on the Lord Jesus Christ. Saw, pound, pound, pound. Build a house for Jesus with love all around. Saw, pound, pound, pound. Build a house for Jesus with love all around. The sea of Galilee. The sea of Galilee. The sea of Galilee. There's a boat on the Sea of Galilee. There's a boat on the Sea of Galilee. There's a boat. There's a boat. There's a boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are men. There are men. There are men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are hands. There are hands. There are hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are nets in the hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are nets in the hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are nets. There are nets. There are nets in the hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are fish in the nets in the hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are fish in the nets in the hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. There are fish. There are fish. There are fish in the nets in the hands of the men in the boat in the Sea of Galilee.
Good evening. Have some folks that we need to continue praying for. Don't know if you saw on Facebook, but to continue praying for Jennifer and Mike. Mike is recovering from surgery, and Jennifer is now scheduled to have surgery on September 5th. So be keeping Mike and Jennifer in your prayers. Rusty is also recovering from surgery on his shoulder, so be praying for him. Diane is home, but she is weak. But she is doing a little bit better. Be also praying for Bev Stewart's son, Scott. He's still in the hospital, but he's doing okay. Also keep Fred Edens in your prayer as he's continuing to receive treatment for some chronic issues and chronic pain. And then also be keeping Danny in your prayers in his recovery. It's progress, but it's slow at this point. Also, next week, I think, is when we'll start the story, the book. So if you want a copy, there are some of the copies are already here in the foyer. If you want a copy, grab yourself one. If we run out, there are more coming. So feel free to grab a copy of that, and we'll start that next Wednesday. Any other announcements or people to be praying for? Yeah, Matt?
To piggyback on what you just said about the book, the intention of the book is that everyone reads in advance, so you show up prepared. So it won't help if you don't read. If you don't read the whole book, just read the next lesson coming or the next chapter coming up.
Matt said do your homework. That's what he said. Somebody else? Anybody else to pray for or things we need to mention? All right, let's pray together. Father, we thank you for this week that you've blessed us with. Thank you so much for this moment where we get to spend time with you and spend time in your word. I pray that you'd bless us these next few moments, these next few minutes in song, and as we read your word and study together. Help us to be encouraged, to be strengthened as we're at the middle of our week. Help us to take what we learned tonight and to use it to glorify you in this next few days. Pray a special blessing on all those who are dealing with health issues. Think a lot for those who are recovering from surgery. Just pray that you'd bless them and help them to regain strength. Pray also for those who are starting school. A lot of our young people starting school, maybe it's college or high school or younger grades. Pray that you just watch over them in this new year and that you'd bless them as they continue to learn. Thank you so much for all that you do for us, and it's in Christ we pray. Amen.
Good evening. Our first song tonight is Nearer, My God, to Thee. Nearer, my God, to Thee, nearer to Thee, King, with Thee across that raiseth me. Next song is When We All Get to Heaven. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be today. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon His beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be today. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. And our last song is This World Is Not My Home. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open
Good evening, everyone. So, let's see if we can get this to work. I thought that was my phone going off, but it's not. All right, so we got Paths of Life, the book of Ecclesiastes. And what's the first thing that comes to your mind at the prospect of diving into this book, the book of Ecclesiastes? What's the first thing that comes into your mind? Are you familiar with it? You're familiar with it. Time for everything. Yeah, chapter 3. Yeah. And does it help from that popular song? You know what I'm talking about? The Byrds. They had a song in 1960, Turn, Turn, Turn. You know what I'm talking about? I'd sing it to you, but I'm not that great at singing. That might come to your mind, I suppose, and that's largely chapter 3. Anything else? Time for everything? What's most important? Yeah. I'm sure all of you have gone to church, have heard many sermons that have quoted the last few verses of Ecclesiastes, and that is the fear of God. The end of the matter is this: the fear of God, or to fear God and to keep His command. This is the whole duty of man. You know, that sounds familiar. That might come to your mind. So, there's a variety of things in this book, but in some ways, some people, when they think of this book, it's depressing. Like, why cover this book? It's depressing. Everything is meaningless. Vanity. Nothing matters. It's very depressing in a way. In fact, I kind of went back and forth a little bit on this, and I was offering some ideas as to what I might cover. And I announced to the kids, I'm thinking of doing Ecclesiastes, and one of them said quickly, "Oh, what's the point?" And it's his way. He knew what Ecclesiastes was about, and so that was an interesting thing there. But yeah, the conclusion of the matter is to fear God and to keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. That's where we're heading. That's what Solomon concluded at the end there. As I went back and forth on this as to whether or not to do Ecclesiastes, because there's a lot in there. There's 12 chapters, and there's a lot in there. And I thought about doing something different, but then I realized we're going to start the book, the story, and Ecclesiastes is not covered in that particular book, which I can understand. And so I thought, well, okay, this is our chance to cover it. We got this one lesson, 1 week that we can cover Ecclesiastes, and we'll try to get through it as best we can. I'm not going to cover every single word, but we'll have to skip a lot of things, and we'll try our best to summarize it. Just to give you some introductory remarks, if you can see this okay. Hopefully it's big enough. But when the seasons are changing, do you feel it? Summer's over. I think last year when I said to somebody here, I said, well, it's official. Summer's over. And I said, what are you talking about? We still got a few weeks yet. And I said, well, the pumpkin spice came out, so it's over. Summer is over. So, but you can feel it in the wind, especially this week. You can feel it's getting cooler, the season. And this causes people sometimes to begin to reflect a little bit about things that are happening, changes that are going on. I mean, we are noticing the plants are completing their time. Some of them are dying. Some of them are at least going dormant. And that fits with chapter 3 as there's a time for everything. And then, of course, yet there's another football season coming. That's something that people look forward to. And we just had Move Up Sunday. Sometimes other things in our lives causes us to pause and reflect and to think about the path that we're on. And that's kind of the theme, the paths of life, such as getting a new job or getting married or having a child or retiring or even a death in the family. Things like this cause you to kind of step back and reflect a little bit. Am I on the right path? What's the point kind of thing? It kind of gets you down that way. But, just to keep in mind, people need to find meaning and purpose in their lives beyond just surviving. I think we can all agree with that. And otherwise, if you don't find these sorts of things, depression, despair, and even, sad to say, suicidal thoughts may lurk, and people look for meaning in family and friends and pleasure and money and power and material things, okay? But we all must face that burning question, and that is, what is the ultimate meaning of life? And Solomon explores that question in this book, and perhaps this is a heavy topic for our Wednesday evening, but if not now, when, right? When would we ever tackle such a thing? You need to tackle such things now and then. And with this lesson, I mostly want to spark your interest in this book, Ecclesiastes, so that you'll take 30 minutes, and literally, it only takes you 30 minutes to read from beginning to end of Ecclesiastes. However, it'll suck you in, and you'll read it again and again and again, because there's a lot in there, and you're like, what is Solomon saying here? But just keep your head above water and realize the end of the matter is to obey God, keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. So that's the easy way to look at this. Making sure I'm not missing anything. Some more thoughts on this. I think is this the right? We're doing the same thing last time. Okay. On slide 3. There we go. Somehow I think I might have. Does that say slide 3 up there? There's the introduction. I think that's slide 2. Right? No. Right? Introduction. And then, okay, chapter 1. Okay. All right, yeah. I had to separate some slides out because the notes were so many. But anyway, Ecclesiastes, the word Ecclesiastes, does anybody know what the word Ecclesiastes means? No? Okay. Well, it means teacher or preacher. It means one who brings together the assembly. And Solomon, the wisest man, and I don't know if you're familiar, but you can read about Solomon in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where God said, ask anything, I'll give it to you. And he asked for wisdom to lead God's people, which is great. And so God granted him wisdom, and he said, nobody will be like you ever. You'll be the wisest. And because he did not ask for the death of his enemies or wealth or fame, God said, I'll give you those things too. So that was kind of nice. You can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 3, in case you're not familiar. But Solomon here, he addresses the assembly in his elder years as a teacher or preacher to help us and help the readers, help the people who heard him to understand our lives, to understand the paths in our lives. Okay, and I found this quote from one commentator. He says, there's more truth and wisdom in these short 12 chapters than all the writings of all the philosophers, of all the ages, of all the countries. That's saying something, right? And he continues on. He says, here we have the wisest man ever to live, Solomon, aside from Jesus, discussing the deepest questions that we all face in life. That's pretty interesting, pretty broad, big statement there. He also said, it is an inspired book Solomon wrote as the Spirit moved him. If you're familiar, that's as the Spirit moved him is from 1 Peter 1:20. Many of the authors, Peter wrote, says, yeah, the Spirit moved these people who wrote the Scriptures. And Solomon was certainly in a position to experience many things in life that we may not, such as wealth, power, position. And if you remember, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Not very many people have experienced that. And he vastly excelled in wisdom and knowledge. So that's kind of amazing to think. It's important to state that firmly. Solomon wrote this as an inspired writer, because there are some people that are critical and say, oh, Solomon didn't write this. No. Someone else did. But no, if you study it out, you'll probably find Solomon wrote this. And there are some difficult passages in this book, and we need to understand that Solomon is taking his hearers, his readers, on a journey down many life's paths. So Solomon's going to experiment. He's going to explore going down this path and then going down this path, this other path. And he's going to tell you his conclusions of those things, and most of which these different paths lead to despair, vanity, as he says. So this is not a book to draw proof texts necessarily. He does not simply give us the answer, but he takes us through his reasoning that led to his conclusion. So that's an interesting thing. I think what's throwing me off is this monitor is not working, and this one is. So I think we're on track. All right, so who would like to read the first 11 verses of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes? It's written in a poetic manner, so it should be fairly easy, right? Go ahead.
The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full, to the place from which the rivers come. There they return again. All things are full of labor, man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new. It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come, but those who will come after.
All right, thanks for reading that. Yes. So let me ask you, what does he mean by saying everything is, as Robert's version said, vanity? Some versions say meaningless. What does he mean by that? Any thoughts? Is it quite the same as our meaning, meaningless? When we say, oh, that's meaningless, does he mean that? We don't use the word vanity very often as, oh, it's vanity. Is it, it's a little weird, isn't it? A little different.
Like it doesn't gain you anything?
Yeah.
There's
Like it's
lasting
futile. Yeah, that's exactly, I think that's exactly right. Yeah. Or did I have it up there? You're looking up there?
I don't know.
Okay. I can't remember if I put, okay. Yeah, it comes from a Hebrew word, hebel. I don't know how to pronounce Hebrew, but it means lacking real substance, which is kind of what you hit on. Lacking real substance, lacking value, lacking permanence or significance. Kind of like a vapor. You know, in the wintertime when you breathe out, you can see your breath and then it disappears rather quickly. It's breath-like. It appears to imply both that which is transitory and that which is futile or futile. It emphasizes how swiftly earthly things pass away and how little they offer while one has them. And I got James 4:14 up there, and to save you the time, I'll just read it to you. It says, why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while, then vanishes. You ever think of your, you don't often think of your life that way, but that's kind of a depressing thought. You're just a mist. You're here for a little while, then you're gone. It's kind of sad, right? In fact, some people look at the book of Ecclesiastes and say, oh, well, Solomon, yeah, he wrote this, but this is when he was in his apostate, his falling away state. And he just says all these things. It's not really, maybe it shouldn't even be in the Bible. That's what some people say. And I think they misunderstand what Solomon's getting at. Because as you read through this, Solomon does sprinkle in a lot of things about God and telling you, remember God, remember your Creator. And he tells you at the end of the matter is to obey God. This is your whole duty. So I don't think what he's doing, he's like saying, look, things can seem dire, but let me take you down this road and let me show you how things can be different. So anyway, that's what I think he means here in this idea of meaningless, everything's meaningless. And It's the idea of what is gained from your labors is another way to think of this. Everything continues as it has for generations. What have you done, or what you have done will need to be done again. You think that you have washed all your dishes, and from another room there appears something else that has to be washed. And even when you've washed all the dishes, it's only a few hours that you have to wash them again. This is something, a lot of our work here in this life, in this world, is cyclical, and much of it does seem futile. Why? Have you ever told your kids to make your bed, and the first thing you say, why? I'm just going to mess it up again when I get in. You know, that it's futile in their thinking. Many times we might think there's no impact, there's nothing new, no one remembers the former generations, but you got to remember that Solomon has a context here. The context of these depressing thoughts is that is under the sun. While we're here on this earth, the material and physical world, things can seem temporary, futile, not benefiting much. And, you know, this is not so much condemning the toils of this life, but they can often leave one with a feeling of not being fulfilled or content, lacking purpose. Your work will not last as long as God's work, which is His creation. And, you know, for Solomon to bring this out, it's saying something, because if you remember, he's the one that built the temple. And he built other buildings as well, his palace. And the temple lasted almost 400 years. It lasted a long time. I mean, he built all these temples, and we'll read a little bit about it. He could say, look what I've done. I've done all this stuff. Instead, he looks at it as like, it's meaningless. It's meaningless because there's something better, something more out there. So basically, all life based upon the material, physical, temporal things is empty, void, meaningless, vain, without ultimate purpose. What real gain is there when all is said and done? You will work all your life and then die only to be forgotten. Even with all your work, you are never satisfied completely. The earth continues on just as before. Your life counts for little. So let me ask you this. Do you think maybe God designed it that way on purpose? You think that's the case? You can look at your life and say, there's got to be something more than this life. Yeah, great.
You have to look at it like this. This is the world that man has created for himself. Everything in this world is temporary.
Yeah.
Nothing is permanent.
That's right.
Those only things that are eternal are spiritual things.
That's
you
right.
Look at chapter 12, verses 13 to 14.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good comment. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's where we're heading. Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. We gotta have our head screwed on straight, kind of thing. So now if we stopped here in these thoughts, it is sort of a grim picture indeed. But this is, again, strictly from a materialistic viewpoint, that is all there is, emptiness. So the question arises, what is the point of living? And this is the question that the atheist cannot answer, the agnostic cannot answer. They try to cover up this question or block it out or fill the void with other things that are temporary, as you mentioned. But it is the ultimate question, and no philosophy can deal with this question adequately without considering God and eternity. That's the thing to keep in mind. If you think of it this way, the whole book becomes more simple. And if you look, the next Ecclesiastes 1, verse 12, through much of the rest of the book, Solomon gives his basis for saying these things. He gives evidence upon which he based his conclusion that life is vanity. He gives both personal experiences and observations of other men and matters in general. He looks at things with many, looks at the things that many people seek meaning in, and so he eliminates them. I almost picture him as an older gentleman trying to explain to a lot of younger people, saying, look guys, I've gone down that road, and it's meaningless. Don't do it. I've gone down this road, and it's not good. So he's trying to advise other people of these things. So just for completeness, in chapter 1, let's read verses 12 through 18 just to kind of get a further sense of what he's getting at. And we won't read the whole book, but we'll get through some large sections, I guess. So if you look in verse 12, it says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. So you really see where he's at here. But he's taking us on a journey. And I thought it was interesting. He mentions this, what a heavy burden God has laid upon us. And I don't know for sure, but I think perhaps he's saying that the heavy burden was this ambitious goal to explore by wisdom all that is done under the sun. And he found them to be meaningless. And he says, what is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. And a thought that I found, one commentator said, knowledge that is not illuminated by God is really utterly unsatisfying. And another way to look at it, God gave man a desire to know the world around him. You know, we all have this curiosity to know things around us. But on the other hand, not the ability to completely know. And that's frustrating, isn't it? As you study things in this world, you might answer a few of your questions, but you get a zillion more questions, and it's a little bit frustrating. In fact, he touches on this in later verses in the book. He talks about how man cannot know everything. You can't know. And an example of this is in chapter 3, verse 11. He says this similar thing. He says, he has made everything beautiful in his time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Do you think of that? He set eternity in our heart, but yet we cannot fathom the beginning to the end. We can't fathom it. And there's other verses like that throughout this book, and we'll touch on a few of them. But in chapter 7, verse 24, he says a similar thing. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? So he's like saying, this is frustrating because you can't understand everything. And there's other verses too in here. And in fact, we're covering Romans chapter 8 in Billy's class on Sunday mornings. But there's one verse in Romans chapter 8, verse 20. If you look at that, it uses the phrase vanity or the word vanity. In some of your versions, I think mine uses a little bit different. It uses frustration. Chapter 8, verse 20 of Romans, it says, for creation was subjected to frustration. King James says vanity, and the ESV says futility was subjected to vanity or frustration or futility, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. I think that God wanted us to see some sort of frustration here so that we'll seek Him. We'll seek something beyond the here and now. I think that's the design of this. So chapter 2. Now, I don't know about you, but it's so hard to cut things out. and in chapter 2, there, like I said, we can't read it all because we're limited on time. But in chapter 2, he explains a little bit about himself. So if you look in verses 1 through 16, it says, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good, but that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I brought I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became far greater than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward of all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So it's the same sentiment. You know, he does come out and he said wisdom is better than folly, so he sees something there. But the same fate awaits them both those who seek after folly and those who seek after wisdom. This is the same faith. Both will die and are quickly forgotten. And he's coming to realize, he explains this in chapter 2. He says he's going to die too. Just like the fool. And he's the wisest guy, yet he's going to die just like the fool. So he's saying, what advantage did he have being wise? And then later he goes on, he says he hated life. If you look in verse 17 of chapter 2, he actually says, so I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things that I had toiled under for the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish, yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun, for a person may labor with wisdom and knowledge and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. He goes on in verse 24. He says, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from God, the hand of God. So he's recognizing God. He's not completely reprobate, you might say. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing wealth to the hand, only to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So a lot of interesting things there. And sometimes I'm sure we might feel the same way when you're working really hard, you're staying late, you're giving up weekends to work for the company, whatever you work for, knowing that many of your coworkers are home with their families, and you're like, I'm working hard, and they're benefiting from my hard work. And Solomon feels that way as well. But I also met a guy once where he loved to bake, prepare food. And he would prepare it in an artistic manner. And I said, I wondered if it bothered him that maybe some people don't recognize the art. And they just gobble it up. It's gone. It's like, it's only there for a short time. He said no. He liked it to do it anyway. But I saw the negative part of it. But Solomon here says, you could do nothing better than to eat, drink, and find satisfaction in your own toil. That's in verse 24. Be content, and most of all, be thankful to God. That's something I came across a Church of Christ down in Florida that they did 14 sermons on this book. And it was rather good. And he talked about the parable of the guy that harvested a lot and he built bigger barns. And what was absent in that parable was the guy didn't express any thanks to God. And the idea is God gives us, he wants us to enjoy things. But understand it's just for here. It's just for a while. And we should thank him. Most of all, thank him for the things that he's given us. But I must hasten on. If you look in chapter 3, this is that most famous section, famous by that song from the 1960s. You guys remember it, right? By the Birds, to everything, turn. You know that song, right? And this is the section, chapter 3, verses 1 through 8 here. And if you just, I won't read it to you, but if you just skim through it, you see that there's antithetical, the opposites, the time to be born, a time to die, time to kill, a time to heal, all these things, a time to build, a time to tear down. It has these opposites. And one of the things that I thought of in this is that these things, it's important to do these things at their appropriate time. And that's what it says later in verse 11. It says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. So there's a time for everything, but if you don't do them at their proper time, it perhaps is not so beautiful. But I ran across somebody else was interpreting this slightly different and saying, each of these things, most everything here, a time for this and a time for that, is going to visit you in your life at some point. And that's okay. You're going to have a time of sadness, a time of happiness. You're going to have times where you need to speak up, a time to be silent, a time to love, and interesting, a time to hate. These things will visit you, but God will make these things beautiful in their time. That reminded some people of a verse. I don't have it written down. Oh yeah, here it is. Romans 8:28. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him." He's not saying that you always have good things. I mean, sometimes you'll have bad things, but He'll work the bad things for your good. And in that way, you can look back at the bad things and see the beauty in them. There's some beauty in them. But anyway, there's some interesting things here. And also in verse 11, God has set eternity in the human heart. And it's important to know that and realize that as you go through the rest of the book. You have to know that eternity is in the human heart. Solomon knows that. He recognizes that. In other words, you're not exactly like an animal. You may, because Solomon says later that, hey, you're just like an animal. But you're not exactly, okay? So it's important to keep some of this stuff in mind as you read through it. And again, he repeats the idea that nothing better than to be happy and to do good. That's what it says in verses 12 through 13 of chapter 3. But interesting thing here, he says, what God does endures forever. And that stands in contrast with Solomon's grief over man's toil, which is only temporary. It's only a vapor, a mist. And this humbles us and causes us to reverence God. And I think that an example of this is we stand in awe sometimes of the Roman ruins. And those have been around for, a few millennia, but how much more of God's handiwork has stood many, many, many millennia. So there's a bit of a difference there. And there will even be a time, if you look in verse 17 of chapter 3, there'll be a time for God to judge. Judgment is coming on both the righteous and the wicked. If you flip over to verse 17 there. And in verse 21, there's a bit of a difficult passage there. It says, who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? Well, Solomon knows because he said he knows in chapter 12, verse 7, I think it is. So you got to read these things in context. That he knows that the spirit returns to God. But I want to hurry to get to the end because the end I think is very special. In chapter 4, again I don't want to read it, but you see there is oppression, and people who are oppressed sometimes may come to a point where they feel as though the dead are happier than the living. And it's better to have, sometimes if you're oppressed, better to have never been born. These are some sad things that he's talking about. And he also talks about the toil and achievement that springs from envy is meaningless. Sometimes that's the idea of, back when I was a kid, we used the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, kind of the idea that you're trying to keep up with your neighbors and have what they have. That's actually envy, and that's meaningless, he's saying. He talks about later in chapter 4 about striking a balance, and he also talks about how it's not good to be alone, but to have friends and have family and things. He talks about these things. Otherwise, if you don't have any family or friends, you'll be toiling away and thinking, I'm working for nothing, you know. So there's all these things. He's also points out at the end of chapter 4 that sometimes people want a youthful successor, thinking of get rid of the old king, bring in a new young king. And he points out, well, they're going to be dissatisfied with the young guy as well eventually. So the grass is always greener on the other side, and I think we can see this sort of thing in our politics as well, that you're never satisfied. Chapter 5, he gives a lot of advice from an older man, and he points out you should really know your position when you're approaching God and not to delay fulfilling your vows. And he talks about many words mark the speech of a fool. And he says, do not be surprised when justice and righteousness, rights are denied. That's something I think we often talk about. Can you believe this happened? You know, how justice is denied or rights are denied. But he says, don't be surprised. That's the way things are in this world. And then he also, some lessons that we all know. Whoever loves money never has enough. A laborer's sleep is sweet, but not for the rich. Hoarded wealth harms its owner. That's in verses 10 through 14. And oftentimes we hear, you come into this world naked and you go out of this world naked. And so what do you gain, right? He says it's appropriate to eat, drink, and find satisfaction. It is a gift from God. Of course, don't leave out the idea of thanking Him and to reflect on your days, because God keeps them occupied with the gladness. But there's just so much packed in this book. And if you look at chapter 6, God gives but does not grant them the ability to enjoy. That's interesting. Not enjoying the gifts of God is more of a commentary on the person, and we need to count our blessings and enjoy them. And if you cannot bring yourself to enjoy what God has given you, then a stillborn is better off. Interesting words that he has to say. I mean, he's brutally honest in many ways. And then in chapter 7, just trying to breeze through these really quickly because I want to get to the conclusion of this matter. And he mentioned, and we might hear this sometimes at funerals, it's better to go to a house of mourning than a house of feasting. And he explains why in chapter 7, verse 2. He says, for death is the destiny of everyone, and the living should take this to heart. And then later in verse 4, he says, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools in the house of pleasure. So that's some interesting things. God made both the good times and the bad. In verse 14, he says that, and God has made mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. That's interesting to think about in our situation. Need to keep our focus on God. But moving into chapter 8, he says, wisdom brightens their face. Wickedness will not release those who practice it. And I thought to myself, the first thing that comes to my mind is somebody who becomes addicted to something. That wickedness will not release you. The best thing is just to stay away. In order to get out, you have to fight your way out. And you've, I'm sure, heard many stories about people who have been addicted to something and they just have to fight their way out. And righteousness, the righteous get, this is what's sad, the righteous sometimes get what the wicked deserve. And that's in verse 14. And there's nothing better for a person than to eat and drink and be glad. And he also says in verse 17, no one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. And Solomon knows it will go better for those who fear God, verses 12 through 13. And I think in this section he's talking about, in some ways he talks about those who live on earth, they live long on earth. And then later in verse 13 he's talking about he's thinking about eternity. So it's sometimes hard to interpret his words here, but I want to rush on this. In chapter 9, he points out that in verses 1 through 6, he says, so I reflected on all this and concluded that the righteous and the wise and what they do are in God's hands. But no one knows whether love or hate awaits them. All share a common destiny. So it's interesting. And he says the evil in everything, there's evil in everything under the sun, and death comes to all. The living have hope, enjoy life wherever you can. And another interesting part in chapter 9, if you look in verses 11 through 12, it says, I have seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. And that's interesting. He said, moreover, no one knows when their hour will come. As fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds are taken in a snare, so people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. And that's kind of, so many times we think, God's going to take care of me and things. But he says in here, time and chance does happen to them all. Remember, Jesus told about the situation. He says, what do you think? That tower that fell on those people, they were less righteous than the others? He said, no, it just happened. Yes, Graydon.
As you go on here, it seems like things are getting worse and worse. And then you realize the only joy we have is in God.
That's right. Yeah, that's where we're heading. Yeah, that's definitely right. Yeah. And then in chapter 10, he says a little folly outweighs honor. And look in verse 3 in chapter 10, it says, even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. And the first thing that popped in my mind when I saw that was years ago, people used to walk around with their pants hanging down. Now, you remember that? Where their pants are hanging down. It's like, it fits this verse. It says, even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. That's what I thought of. So anyway, he goes on and he says, the heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. And he just gives a lot of common sense advice in these things. And then quickly going into chapter 11 here, again, he touches on this idea that you cannot understand the work of God in verse 5. Now, I guess in chapter 11, he kind of transitions. He says, now that he has shown the futility of all earthly and materialistic reason, he shows the solution. And if you look in verse 5, he says, as you do not know the path of the wind, or how the body is formed in a mother's womb, so you cannot understand the work of God, the maker of all things. And Solomon corrects his thinking to include God and eternity. He does not stop at just the existence of God, but marvels at his power and stands in awe of God. This is a God in whom you can rejoice and be happy, a God you can serve all your life with meaning and purpose, not just some made-up God to appease. The Almighty God in whom you can find meaning and purpose and happiness for eternity. He begins his summation in verse 9 of chapter 11, where he encourages them to be happy. Let your heart give you joy. And that's similar to what how Jesus began his public ministry on the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. In some versions, we call them Beatitudes, but some versions says, blessed are they who are poor in spirit. Or some of them say, happy are those who are poor in spirit and those who are mourn and those who hunger and thirst. Jesus started out his, and he's saying here, Solomon he's beginning his summation and saying, be happy, let your heart give you joy. And then in verses 9 through 10, he even says, live your life in consideration of your relationship to him. Consider everything in light of God's supremacy and banish anxiety from your heart. In other words, don't worry. And just to quickly go in here in chapter 12, in chapter 12 here, he says, remember him and remember your Creator in your youth. To try to find God through self-pleasing, for a self-pleasing life is to fail forever. But to enthrone God first and find life through Him is to ever have meaning and fullness. This is similar to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 39, which you're familiar with. It says, whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. That's kind of what Solomon is saying. And then in verse 8, Solomon repeats the point. In verse 8, he says, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. Life without God is meaningless, and in verse 9 through 12, he tells how he sought to make others understand his wisdom. Then he finishes by making the statement in the last two verses in 13 and 14. He says, "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Understanding and acting upon this leads to eternal happiness, rejoicing and blessing. With this view in mind, the pessimism of materialism will never be known. The emptiness and meaninglessness of life fades. The despair of living under the sun will not be prominent in your life. It is to find life under the sun as well as over the sun. It gives light to the problems that are otherwise dark and dismal." Jesus stated this similarly in John chapter 15. He says, "If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this, to love each other as I have loved you." And some have pointed out that the word duty in that phrase where it says, "For God will bring every," it says, "Fear God and keep his commandment, for this is the whole duty of mankind." Some pointed out that the word duty doesn't belong there. It's not in the original. And if you take that out, it becomes a little bit different. It says that this, if you fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man, okay? It gives a little bit different meaning. It's not so much as our duty as it is our essence, our purpose, our meaning in life, right? The meaning of life is to fear God and keep his commandments, to live in consideration of his supremacy and ultimate judgment. It is interesting that throughout the book of Solomon, he makes the case that life here under the sun is meaningless, and yet concludes with what gives life meaning. Do you see the irony there? And Jesus made basically the same point in Matthew chapter 16, where he says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit the soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" You see how Jesus is saying the same thing as Solomon. It's an interesting thing there. What I hope is I have excited a little bit in you to go home, just take 30 minutes, and you'll read from beginning to end of this book, and it's going to suck you in, I think. And you're going to be wondering more and more about this Solomon and what he is saying. But that's a quick summation of Ecclesiastes, and we're out of time. But I wanted to tell you that next week, as we mentioned already, we're going to start the series of the story. And I did a quick calculation. We're going to have 31 lessons, 31 chapters in that book. So the entire Bible is going to be covered in 31 lessons. That's kind of amazing. I mean, some people, we struggle to read through the Bible in 52 weeks. We're going to go through it in 31. And if you take that by 45 minutes, that's 23 and a quarter hours, okay? So you're going to go through Genesis through Revelation in just 23 and a quarter hours. That's amazing. So next week, we're going to cover Genesis chapter 1 through 11. I would suggest get the book, read it, but also Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is not very difficult reading, and you can read it very quickly. Read it both in the story and in the full text of the Bible, and you'll be well prepared for what we're going to talk about next week. But thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time.